Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. It's always exciting and also a little bit rare when I see an email show up with the title New Film. And that's exactly what happened recently when Harman reached out to see if I'd be interested in testing out their latest offering, Kentmere 200. But what's even more exciting is when the new film you're testing performs. And in this case, Kentmere 200 certainly lived up to, if not exceeded, my expectations, giving us a nice new addition to the black and white film market and one that's a little easier on the wallet. So Kentmere 200, this is the third addition to the lineup, giving us a trio of these budget films from Harman now. And I was sent a few rolls a few weeks before launch, so 2 120 rolls, 2 in 35mm format, 24 exposure rolls to be exact. So not a ton of film or a ton of time, but tried to do as much as I could with what I had to best understand how this performs. So I shot in some pretty harsh lighting conditions, did a small exposure test, and even shot a roll of FP4 alongside this. And I came away from it feeling like I have a pretty good idea of what to expect from this new film. So in this video today, I'm going to share my results with you and my experience, and hopefully help you decide if this one's for you or not. So if you're completely new to the films from Kentmere, these are made by Harman, aka Ilford, and these were released as more of a budget offering compared to the premium films from Ilford, HP5 and FP4 to be exact. And when the 100 and 400 speed versions were released, Ilford stated that they have lower performance due to having less silver. So really, I would say that Kentmere is positioned to compete against something like Fomapan. You know, they're similarly priced, and we have kind of a matching trio of speeds now. And the 100 and 400 speed were originally released in 35mm only. A few years back, we got them in 120, which was exciting. But the 200 speed is a completely new film, and we're getting it in both formats right away. So I did a review of the 100 and 400 speed films back when they were announced in 120 format. And that was my first experience with Kentmere, and I remember being quite happy with the results from both. They handled high contrast scenes well, quite sharp, grain wasn't too harsh, and with a hybrid workflow, scanning the negatives, I could easily get a look that I was happy with. This 200 speed version though, Harman claims has a bit of a different look. They say, Kentmere Pan 200 is an ISO 200 black and white film with enhanced contrast versus 100 and 400, pleasing well-controlled grain and good sharpness, making it suitable for most shooting applications and conditions. So going into this, I was pretty excited to see how it looked. So when it comes to price, I was told that the 200 speed is going to be priced the same as the other versions, so £5 across the board for both 120 and 35mm formats. And in comparison, I have prices up right here for HP5 and FP4. This is in the UK, of course it's going to all depend on where you buy it, but right now, HP5 and FP4 in 120 format both come in at £6.75. That's the cheapest I could find them for, and £8 for HP5, £7.25 for FP4 in 35mm format. So the Kentmere films are going to save you a little bit of money, maybe around £2 to £3, depending on where you buy it. And then Fomapan, like I said, probably the direct competitor to the Kentmere versions, around £5.50 to £6 for both 35 and 120. So for me, Kentmere, becomes kind of the go-to budget black and white film, especially when you consider that it's being made by kind of the biggest black and white film manufacturer. And that's something I'll talk about a little later. Okay, so time to dig into how this film performs, starting with the look of it. So for this video, I shot all the 120 rolls using a Bronica GS1 and the 35mm in a Canon EOS 30. And then I developed all the film here at home using kind of my standard go-to process. So rotary development using Ilford DDX as a developer. And then I digitized all the film using my Lumix S5 IIX and Sigma 70mm macro lens, and then converted the files with Negative Lab Pro. The conversion and edits afterwards were very simple. There was no heavy tweaking. Some images were almost just straight conversions with the default settings. And I will say overall, I've really enjoyed the look from Kentmere 200 that I was able to achieve. Using DDX as a developer, I found the film to have really pleasing contrast straight from conversion, not too harsh, but also not too flat. Compared to the 100 and 400 speed versions, I would say that this felt like it had just a little bit more punch to it. But overall, the contrast never seemed too crunchy. There was always still shadow and highlight detail and room to edit. I also shot a few images at twilight with some long exposures where I had to take a guess when it came to reciprocity calculations, and even those frames turned out great, retaining detail in both the sky and even the darkest shadow areas. The only thing that I did notice was some slight blooming in extreme highlight areas, most noticeable with 35mm rolls. This image, for example, was shot at midday, and you can see the specular highlights and kind of bright edges have some blooming and softness. So from a look standpoint, I gotta say I was quite happy with how Kentmere 200 performed, but as mentioned, I did shoot one roll of FP4 alongside this, and that is where I could start to notice just some really subtle differences. They weren't major, but we'll take a look at those and also take a look at grain and sharpness and this exposure test as well. But first, before we do that, just have to quickly talk about the sponsor today, which is Squarespace. So as a photographer, Squarespace has been such a helpful tool over the years. It gives me a way to make a nice professional looking website and keep it up to date very easily. For example, they have things like their blueprint builder, which lets you build your site from scratch, but also gives you helpful tools like different layout options or font pairings and color palettes. But then also just things like adding a gallery or updating one. You can click and drag to rearrange and reorder images, to play with sequencing, easily change image sizes, add thumbnails, and then even do things like add an online store if you want to sell books, prints, and other things like that. So check out squarespace.com today, sign up for a free trial, test it out. When you're ready to launch, you can use my link below to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. All right, so next up, we're going to take a look at how the film performed when it comes to grain and sharpness. And obviously, the two format sizes differ a little bit. So first, with the 120 version, I would say the grain is actually quite pleasing. It's what I expected for a 200 speed film. It's there, but it's not really harsh. It almost feels smooth is maybe the best way to put it. And especially when looking at, say, like normal size scans, it's actually quite minimal, and it's not until you start scanning at a very high resolution that it becomes more noticeable, but still fine for my preferences. Sharpness as well, very good in 120. I was perfectly happy with the performance of it. In 35mm format, the grain is quite a bit more noticeable as expected, but like I said before, it doesn't feel that harsh. Sharpness as well, with the smaller format, is still very good. So again, even though on paper, the Kentmere films aren't supposed to perform as good as the Ilford ones, with the results I got from these first few rolls, there weren't any glaring shortcomings where it felt like I was really giving up a lot. For the most part, I was really happy with the results. But as mentioned, I did shoot a roll of Ilford FP4, and there were some subtle differences. We'll jump on the computer now, we'll take a look at those. Okay, as we get into this, just wanted to mention quickly, I had to use a Pentax 6x7 for the Ilford FP4 frames. I don't have a second back for the Bronica, and I wanted to shoot these at the exact same time. So the lenses between the two films are different, both very good. I used the 75 4.5 for the Pentax, 80mm 3.5 for the Bronica, some of the best kind of for their respective systems, but that could still have a little bit of an effect. I'm pretty confident that the difference we're seeing is, the different films. It is subtle though, and I would say regardless, if the lens was factoring in, that almost just makes it even more impressive, say if the FP4 was getting an advantage from the Pentax optics, but I don't think that's the case because I feel very good about both lenses. Anyways, though, getting into this, we have the Kentmere right here. We'll go into a reference mode, so Kentmere on left and FP4 on right, and you'll see right away when we look at these side by side, kind of full image, the overall look is very similar between the two. These are both developed with DDX, one after another, same conversion process and everything, and they're not that far off at all. There are just these subtle differences that I notice consistently throughout, which I'll show you in 1 second, but detail and specifically grain right now, I would say FP4 is a little bit cleaner, which is to be expected, just a bit slower of a film. And fine detail and sharpness, you might not be able to see this on YouTube. It looks a bit better on the FP4 image, if we're looking in this pathway here. The Kentmere is a little bit behind. Again, this could potentially be from the lens. I doubt it, but it could also be something like critical focus. Regardless though, these both look very, very good. The FP4 has a slight advantage. But yeah, Kentmere is still impressive. But the difference that I noticed throughout these is when we get to kind of the extreme ends of the tonal range. So the FP4 images seem to be able to hold detail a little bit better in the very bright highlights and the dark shadows, and almost just had this like nicer micro contrast, very subtle, but I'll show you what I mean. So if we go into this bright wall here lit by the sun, you'll see the Kentmere is almost just a bit flat, whereas the FP4 seems to just have a bit more definition. And then even if we go up here to this this roof line, it's like the shadows in the bright areas, just a little more crisp, a little more punch compared to the Kentmere version. But again, so minor between both of these. And you'll see the same if we go Kentmere on left, FP4 on right. Again, overall look between the two is pretty similar. But if we go in here and we look at the window here, you'll see on the FP4 version, blacks are just a little bit more rich, a little more contrasty. Same with this chimney area. And then especially if we go down to this wall here, you'll see the details just a little bit nicer. And kind of the contrast throughout this wall is just a bit nicer compared to the Kentmere image. And then one more, we'll go Kentmere on left, FP4 on right. Again, so similar between the two of these, how they look. But, you know, if we go in, say, to this area here, we're looking at this bright wood that's lit by the full sun. Even this wood paneling here, you'll see the details just a bit nicer with this FP4 image. And then contrast here, same thing, a little nicer on the FP4. And then even if we look over at the lighthouse, you know, what this area that was red in real life, a little bit more kind of richer blacks or deeper blacks on the FP4 image. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to the look of these two films, this one is not far off at all. All right, and the last thing I wanted to do here was an exposure test. Again, I didn't have a ton of film, so I couldn't get too extreme with this, but I did normal exposure, went down to 3 under and 4 over. And I would say the results were as I expected, you know, pretty standard black and white negative film performance, which was nice to see. But we go to reference view. So this is the normal exposure on the left, and we'll go to 1 under on the right here. And you'll see right away there's not a huge difference between these. The shadows are getting like maybe a little muddy in comparison, losing a bit of detail, but I just kept the settings the same between all these. And of course you could go in and edit any of them after. So for example, you could drop the blacks a bit, maybe raise the shadow areas, and all of a sudden, you know, this looks pretty much identical to the normal. So yeah, this is what I would expect typically with negative film. You know, a stop under is still going to be good. You'll see though, as we get to 2 under now, the shadows really start to get muddy. You lose detail, and same at 3. So yeah, as expected, 1 under is fine. I personally wouldn't go any less than that. But if we go now to 1 stop over here on the right, again, very similar. 2 stops over, 3 stops over, and 4 stops over. And this still looks pretty good. The grain is getting more noticeable. And what I'm seeing as you start to go over is just losing almost like a little bit of contrast in the image. The bright highlight areas are getting just a bit muddy in comparison. But even still, you know, 4 stops over is a ton of overexposure. You typically just want to try and expose normally. So this is pretty good flexibility. I would say like anywhere from 1 under to a couple stops over is still going to give you an image that is very workable and gives you room to do what you need. So yeah, overall, I got to say I was pretty happy with how this performed. For me personally, it's probably something that I would shoot for more casual work, or say doing camera reviews and tests. And that's purely just because FP4 and HP5 are what I've worked with for years. They're what I know, and I don't mind spending the little bit of extra money, especially if I'm doing project work. But all going to come down to personal preference. As we saw with this film, it still has a lot of flexibility. It's got a great look to it, and it certainly won't hold you back regardless of what work you're making, at least in my opinion. So anyways, hope you enjoyed this look at the new Kentmere 200. And other than that, just want to say thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.